Hi everyone, my name is Frede and today I've got a couple of recommendations of books to read for Pride Month. Now I know we're already halfway into the month. At the beginning of June I thought I don't have that much to say. And then a couple of days ago, sometime last week, Sophie over at Portal in the Pages uploaded a video with her recommendations and I recommended her some books in the comments, and then I thought I do have quite a lot to say, so I decided to do this video after all. And I mean, it doesn't mean that you can only read those books in June. Like, we should all read much more literature about and by LGBT people. So before I even get into all the books that I have here, I have to say that sadly this isn't even LGBT recommendations, because I don't have a single book which properly represents transgender people. The books that I can come up with from the top of my head right now that I've read with transgender characters, I don't think did it very well. So I don't have any book that features a transgender character or discusses what it's like to be trans. So if you have any recommendations, please leave them in the comments. I do have a couple of books on my radar that I'm hoping to pick up in the next couple of months, but I don't have a single book that I actually own. So we all gotta learn, and this is an area where I still have to learn a lot, I think. I do watch a lot of transgender YouTubers, but I don't think I've ever read a book by a transgender person. So, need to do that. Also, just as a little preface for this video, I suppose why books like these are so important to me and why I'm making this video. So, I myself am bisexual, which actually is kind of, I would say, more of a new identity for myself. When I first came out 6 years ago, back in 2012, up until I met my boyfriend sort of like 2 years ago, I actually identified as lesbian. Now, obviously, given that I have a boyfriend, that's not a label I can really use for myself anymore. And like when I was a teenager and kind of like trying to figure out my sexual orientation, I didn't have any books about people like me, I suppose. So I read a ton of fan fiction, including very sexually explicit fan fiction, which probably isn't the greatest thing for a 14-year-old to read, but that's what I did because there was just nothing out there, or at least nothing that I knew about. So while I don't really read YA and don't know much about the books that are being published there, the little glimpses that I get into, I suppose, that literary scene, I think it's fantastic that there are increasingly more books about LGBT teenagers coming up, because that was something I did not have growing up. And so in this video I'm going to talk about books for adults, basically. I think that I would have also loved these books as a teenager, but they are not specifically YA, they are adult books, which much more appeal to me personally, because as I said, I first came out 6 years ago, and so while I do see the importance for coming out stories, I have no interest in picking up those books. But as I said, I think it's fantastic that those books are out there for people who need it. Now let's actually get into the books that I want to recommend for this video. The first two are books that I'm currently reading, and then the rest of them are just books I picked from my shelf that I read at some point, and they are in no particular order. But first, two books that I'm currently reading. The first one is called Boy Erased by Garrett Conley. If you watched my May vlog, I talked about this a bit in that video. This is a memoir by Garrett Conley, who is a gay American man who survived conversion therapy. So this is the memoir where he talks about his experiences there. I saw him talk at the Literature Center of my town a few weeks ago, and he really left a huge impression on me, and so I went and picked up the book. This is a German translation, but it is available in English, obviously, that's the original language. I think I'm about a fourth of the way in, and it's such a good book so far. It's written very kind of lyrically, you have a lot of jumping around in his narration, but I really enjoy this, and this is a very hard and horrible topic to read about, but I think this makes it even more important to actually pick up books about this. So while I haven't finished reading the book, I would definitely recommend it to you. Another book that I'm currently reading is an essay collection which is called She Called Me a Woman, Nigeria's Queer Women Speak. Now, I'm going to butcher the names of the editors, so I'm sorry about that, but it's edited by three women called Azina Mohammed, Chitra Nagarajan and Rafid Aliyu. And basically what they did here was they talked to a lot of different women in Nigeria who at some point fall under the umbrella queer. Now I know that there are a lot of people who don't like the word queer as an umbrella, but this is what they use here, so this is not me saying this and calling those women queer, but it's really, they are using this word as well. I mean, it's in the title. And so in total you have 25 interviews. All of them are anonymous because in Nigeria there are laws that criminalize homosexuality, and so they are kind of trying to, I suppose, break the silence that in a way exists around, you know, gay people exist in this country. A lot of those stories talk about being cast out from one's family, experiencing horrible violence, you know, a lot of very terrible things, but also so many of these women are still hopeful despite the horrific things they're experiencing just for being who they are. It's a very difficult book to read, but I think especially because of that, it's so important that we read books like this, and I want to really like push this book sort of in your hands because it only has about a handful of Goodreads ratings. Like, I mean, this was also published this year, but it's a small publisher and I have not heard any like publicity about it. I just randomly found this at a bookshop, and so I just think it's so valuable that these 3 women who edited the book are putting those voices that are usually not being heard and that also have to be anonymized here. So please go and buy this book and read it. It's so important. Yeah, just an amazing book, really. So as I said, all of these books I'm going to talk about are in no particular order. I've just got a little stack and I'm just going to go through them. The first one that I want to recommend is a book that I read fairly recently, which is Kissing the Witch by Emma Donoghue. This is a collection of fairy tale retellings, and a lot of them have a sort of female-female relationship twist to them. This was such fun to read. I really enjoyed this. Like, if you like fairy tales, if you like fairy tale retellings, you should really give this a go. It's such fun. It's written well. It's lesbians and fairy tales. So what more could you want? The next book that I have is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. This is a very tiny little book about a young man called David who lives in Paris in the 1950s, and he has a sort of affair relationship sort of thing going on with another man who is called Giovanni. I loved this book a lot. I thought this was written beautifully. I think the characters were crafted really well. The only thing that, but that's not the fault of the book itself, it's just a kind of a trope that I'm very tired of. This is one of those tragic LGBT stories, so if you want to read something happy, then this is not the one. You know, this doesn't end well, and it's not a spoiler to say that because you know you learn this in the first couple of pages. And I do see the value in those books as well, because this one, for example, shows a lot about societal circumstances that make non-heterosexual relationships very difficult, but I'm just tired of tragic LGBT stories. But I would still really recommend this. The next one is actually funny that I should say. I'm not really into coming out stories because it sort of is one, but not really, and that is Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson. So this is a book which is sort of, I would say, semi-autobiographical, but there are still a lot of fictional elements in here where she sort of talks about her upbringing in an evangelical family somewhere in England, and her kind of figuring out that she's a lesbian and how that was received by her community. So while in a way this also is sort of tragic and horrendous, I think the overall tone is much more optimistic and hopeful than, for example, Giovanni's Room, because it's just her as a young person, and then she at some point, you know, I mean, it is an autobiographical story, so it's not a spoiler. At some point she obviously gets to leave home and gets to be who she is. And while this one wasn't the first book that I read with lesbians or other sort of non-heterosexual women characters, this one was the first one that really I saw myself in and that had a huge emotional impact on me because of that. So it's just a fantastic book, and yeah, please go and read it. Another book that I want to point out, which I unfortunately don't have here because I got it from the library back when I read it, and I haven't been able to buy it so far, but that was Zami, A New Spelling of My Name by Audre Lorde. This is her autobiography where she talks about what it was like for her to grow up as a young black girl, as the daughter of immigrants in New York in the 1930s and 40s, what it was like for her to come to terms with her sexual orientation, because if you don't know Audre Lorde, she was also a lesbian. So she talks about that, how she generally experienced coming to terms with that, how she generally experienced relationships. But then she also talks about the intersection of race and sexuality, because obviously as a lesbian she was part of LGBT scene in New York of the 1950s, but she also talks about the racism she was experiencing at the time. So obviously as a white woman, the racism aspect is just something, for me that was very educational, but obviously not something that I can relate to in that way. But all those passages where she talked about her relationship experiences in detail just were so beautiful. And so I would really recommend that book, because I think not just is it a personal life experience sort of story, but through her personal lens you get broader pictures, I suppose, which I really appreciated. And yeah, it's just a fantastic book. The next book that I want to recommend, which I literally finished 2 days ago, is Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. I don't know why it took me so long to read a Sarah Waters book, but it kind of did. This is a chunker of a book and I read it in like 2 days. Which is unheard of for me. Basically this is historical fiction set in the Victorian era in England, and I don't even really want to get into the plot because it's amazing going into this not knowing at all what it's about. But you do have a female-female relationship that kind of develops throughout the book. It's not the main plot in a way, but it's always there, and I just loved it. And I need to get my hands on some more Sarah Waters, because from what I've heard of her, she writes a lot of historical fiction with lesbians. And what more could you want than historical fiction with lesbians? The next book that I have, it's been quite a while since I read that, but I loved it so much while I was reading it, and that is The Colour Purple by Alice Walker. Now, as with Fingersmith actually, the whole female-female relationship thing isn't the main point of the story. In this book you follow a young African-American woman in the American South in, I believe, the 30s, and you follow her as she experiences some very horrendous things. So a lot of trigger warnings for that one. She is raped, she's domestically abused. So it's a difficult book to read, but as the story unfolds, there is also a relationship that she develops with another woman, and I thought that was just done so well. It was so beautiful, and this is why I want to recommend this book in this video as well. So, and then I have one more book left, which, if you've watched me for a while, this won't be no surprise, is The 100 Nights of Hero by Isabel Greenberg. This is an absolutely beautiful graphic novel where Isabel Greenberg uses the concept of 1001 nights. So basically a story and a story and a story and a story, and always ending a story on a cliffhanger and continuing the story the next day. She uses this concept, makes 100 nights out of the 1000, and changes the circumstances a bit. So basically in this book you follow two young women who try to protect themselves from a very cruel man through telling stories. And these two women, they are secretly in love in a fictional world where women are severely oppressed, and two women being in love would be probably one of the worst things you could do. So they tell stories in order to protect themselves, and it's so beautiful. Like, I'm a fairy tale lover, so if you hate fairy tales, maybe this isn't for you. But if you like fairy tales and you haven't read this, please go ahead and do it. So these were a couple of reading recommendations for Pride Month. 100 Nights of Hero was a booktube darling a few years ago, but I still think that most of those books I don't really see a lot of people talk about, so I'm just kind of trying to put these into your hands. Maybe there is something in there that interests you, and even if you don't get to reading it this month, we should try and push forward LGBT voices all throughout the year. Again, as I said in the beginning of the video, if you have any recommendations as to books by and about transgender people, please leave them in the comments, because this is something I really need to read more about. Also, if you have any other recommendations for any sort of LGBT reads, especially female-female relationships, I really like that. And then on top of that, especially stories that are not about coming out and realizing that you're not straight, but books where you're just not straight, and that's your life, and you just go on living your life like that. I would really love some books like that. So please leave all your recommendations in the comments. I wish all of you a wonderful second half of Pride Month. Thank you for watching this video, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!